In 1940, the people of the British Isles stood isolated, bracing themselves for the aerial onslaught that would pave the way for the Nazi invasion. RAF Fighter Command was ready to be the sword and shield against this airborne onslaught, thanks to the leadership, determination and foresight of its commander, Sir Hugh Dowding, a man who was never given the recognition he deserved for laying the foundations for victory in the Battle of Britain. In the spring of 1940, Europe was collapsing under the weight of Hitler's armed forces. The vast German war machine had overpowered Poland and Czechoslovakia. Now they swept into France. The Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command for the Royal Air Force was Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. Dowding's fighting force was in France attempting to stop the Germans overrunning the country. It was a losing battle. Nearly 500 fighters were destroyed and 300 pilots killed. This was a severe drain on the resources of Fighter Command.
We were hopelessly ill-equipped. We didn't all have maps. Only some of us had maps. There weren't enough to go around. And we'd no ground crew with us, so we had to do it all ourselves. Pump fuel in, pour it in from 2-gallon tins.
The army, who were on the beaches at the time trying to get out, were slating the RAF Fighter Command somewhat because they said they never saw any fighters overhead. What they didn't realize, of course, that if we intercepted their bombers over them, it would be too late. They'd be dropping their bombs on them. So we had to intercept them way inland.
France was desperate for reinforcements, and Churchill was about to give in to their requests. But Dowding had other ideas and would clash with his superiors, something he was well known for.
Sirs, in my view, Fighter Command will be pushed to the limit in protecting 11 and 12 groups. I would remind you that your estimate of the number of squadrons required for home defense was 52. I have, at present, 34 for the task.
During his time as an officer pilot in the First World War, he would often question the orders of his Commander-in-Chief, Lord Trenchard.
He had a very big row with Trenchard about his pilots. One of the squadrons, they'd taken quite a beating, and he asked for them to be taken out of the line to rest.
These boys could only win so many dogfights before they were caught out. They needed a break. I put my case, but received orders stating that we were to continue our offensive flights. Other roles in the Royal Flying Corps were rested after a while. If they could do it in other areas, I felt strongly that the rule should apply to pilots as well. I put my case to Trenchard.
Trenchard eventually gave in, but he then decided that Dowding was too soft to be a front-line commander, and shipped him back to England.
The protection of his men had effectively cost him promotion. But this protection was something that followed him into World War II and throughout his life.
It shows, I think, that he really was concerned as though they were his children almost, and he fought battles and battles for them. And the pilots were aware of this, and that's why they held him in such great affection.
In fact, his men affectionately nicknamed him Stuffy.
In the Royal Air Force, you could have a nickname for any reason at all that could be the opposite of what you were. But I think as a loner and a very reserved person, he would be unlikely to join in parties, and people would say, oh, he's a bit stuffy, you know. So the name stayed. Nicknames don't go away, I'm afraid.
In order to get on in the army, you need good capacity to drink well. I drink as little as possible. I have only been drunk twice in my life, and I remember the feeling afterwards well. That is why I do not drink like the others.
But between the wars, Dowding was continually promoted and was instrumental in forming the Royal Air Force. In 1936, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command. He was 53 years old and had reached the rank of Air Marshal. He was determined to build his baby into a premier fighting force whose objective was to defend the country at all costs. He was a pragmatist and a realist. He realized that Fighter Command was best employed protecting the country as a defensive force. And with the advent of war, his dream would be put to the test. As Churchill was about to send more precious Hurricanes to France, Dowding strongly opposed this plan.
I was desperately concerned with convincing the PM how urgent the situation was. I laid the data on the table in front of him and said, if the present rate of wastage continues for another fortnight, we shall not have another hurricane left in France or Britain. That did the trick.
It was decided to fall back from France and prepare for the defense of Britain. But some of Dowding's experienced pilots were left stranded.
It was all pretty chaotic, of course. We were in full retreat. We couldn't get any instructions or orders what to do. So we'd refuel and just go off, do a patrol, looking for trouble.
I made my way back by managing to get a lift on an old lorry, which had a load of potatoes in the back. I was going towards Cherbourg, and the roads were absolutely jammed up with refugees. They had horses towing their cars, and they had their cars loaded to the gills with all their belongings that they could take away. But of course it made our journey extremely hazardous because the roads were so blocked up. We landed at Southampton, and we went by train from there to Waterloo. Going up in the train, I was watching people playing cricket in their whites, and I could hardly believe it after what we'd been through.
The German High Command agreed that Britain must also be invaded in order to stop any further resistance to the Nazi onslaught. At the start of the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe had over 2,500 aircraft in its fighting fleet. By contrast, Fighter Command had barely 550 in flying condition. Dowding knew that his pilots lacked air combat experience, whereas the Germans were supremely confident. The Luftwaffe had blooded their pilots and planes in support of Franco's troops during the Spanish Civil War in 1936. By the beginning of the Second World War, the Luftwaffe had perfected tactics and formations.
Wir haben also schon im Polenfeldzug eben die Erfahrung sammeln können, dann im Frankreich-Feldzug, im sogenannten Frankreich-Feldzug, die Luftkämpfe mit den Franzosen, die schon ganz gute Flugzeuge hatten, zum Teil auch aus Amerika geliefert. Da waren wir auch ganz gut vorbereitet. Außerdem hatten wir taktisch eine damals auch von den Engländern anerkannte bessere taktische Fliegerei.
None of us really knew how to fight aeroplanes. And the Germans had had the experience of the Spanish Civil War.
This experience in actual battle was put to devastating effect against the Polish Air Force at the outset of the war.
We were bombed on the planes, the people were killed, we were hiding in the fields.
We didn't give up. We tried to do our best all the time, but our best wasn't good enough by far.
They managed to overrun us. Of course, they have a lot of technical equipment, especially tanks and aircrafts.
And it was really a catastrophe. I mean, it was so unpleasant.
Not only did the Germans have the experience, they also had the hardware.
Da hatten wir die ersten Me 109 Flugzeuge, also das berühmte Jagdflugzeug. Und wir hatten die ersten Typen, das war noch ein relativ leichtes Flugzeug. Später wurde das ja wurden die Motoren immer stärker, das Flugzeug wurde mehr bewaffnet, stärker bewaffnet. Dann kamen entsprechende Funkeinrichtungen.
The odds were stacked against Hugh Dowding's fighter command.
I had travelled Germany many years before the war, had a lot of German friends, and they're a very, very formidable fighting power, there's no doubt about that.
As the small British fighting force braced itself for the Nazi onslaught, many pilots feared the worst.
They intended to really decimate this country and just use us as slave labor, I suppose, really.
Dowding and fighter command were all that stood between us and a fascist dictatorship.
If it was put to me bluntly, are we going to win this war? I think we should be bloody lucky if we do.
June 1940. The leader of Fighter Command, Hugh Dowding, was tasked with defending Britain against the onslaught of Nazi Germany. His forces were short of planes and pilots, but were prepared to take on the battle-hardened pilots and their aircraft from the mighty Luftwaffe.
It was a vital battle. After all, the Germans wanted to invade us, and they couldn't have invaded us unless they'd got air superiority.
There was much at stake. Waiting across the channel were thousands of troop-carrying barges ready for the invasion. If Fighter Command lost control of the skies, the German invasion would have been unstoppable. Quite simply, Dowding had to win. But there was much in his favor. Since becoming Commander-in-Chief, he had tirelessly worked to establish a structure where communication was vital to every aspect of his control. Dowding had divided the country into 4 separate groups. 13 Group in the north, 12 Group guarding the east coast and the Midlands, 10 Group covering the west, and 11 Group responsible for defending London and the southeast of England. Each group had its own operations centre in direct communication with HQ Fighter Command at Bentley Priory on the outskirts of London. From here, Dowding would oversee the defence of Britain.
HQ Fighter Command monitored the whole of the United Kingdom. Dowding had responsibility for the air defence of the United Kingdom. His job was to ensure that the country was defended. So technically at HQ Fighter Command, it was a monitoring situation. Information being received, passed out to the groups and received back, so he could keep a tally on what was actually happening.
But good communication alone would never defeat the Nazis. Fortunately, Dowding had a secret weapon. While working for the Air Ministry, he pioneered the development of a long-range early warning system called Radio Direction Finding, RDF, or as it would become known, radar. By the outbreak of war, the system was up and running.
The whole world of radar was totally and completely secret, and nobody was allowed to know about it, and nobody ever did.
I cannot give you much information about this system because its existence is very secret. Suffice it to say that we are able to detect the approach of aircraft over the sea to a distance of 60 miles or more, and to plot their courses with fair accuracy.
We had forewarning of the German formations, their size, their height, their direction. We had a lot of advanced information, so it was very important.
A series of masts known as chain home high and low covered south and eastern coasts at varying intervals. They were linked to filter stations, which passed the information onto sector stations and operations rooms.
I was training on what was called CH radar, which was entirely in the business of defence. In other words, picking up bombers at 90 miles range before they ever started crossing the channel and heading in our direction. They were seen on the screen the moment they got up in the air.
Now, this was fed back to HQ Fighter Command at Bentley Priory into their filter room, where it was checked, filtered by filter officers, then passed to the group affected. It would give the controller time to get his aircraft airborne.
Okay, time to scramble.
Fighter Command's control with radar was first class from an interception point of view.
The controllers were able to assess which squadrons should intercept that particular formation and how many aircraft would be, or how many aircraft they estimated would be required to deal with that situation.
It meant that your squadrons could be kept on the ground until the very last minute. The alternative would be to put them up on patrol. And of course, this would have been quite hopeless.
You can't run a standing patrol system hour by hour, 24 hours a day and night sort of thing. Not with the resources we had.
But even this new early warning system had its limitations. Dowding still needed eyes from the ground, relaying the numbers of enemy aircraft to the stations.
Now, once the aircraft had crossed over the coastline, radar stopped. It only pointed seaward. And then, of course, it became the Observer Corps, whose priority was to track the aircraft and report that back simultaneously to HQ Fighter Command.
Somebody would tell you that there were 200 plus, 100 plus, 50 plus coming over. This was when we got warning from the coastal people that the raid was building up and coming over. And a raid did build up, rather like a thunderstorm.
It was very exciting to watch a raid beginning to build up 90 miles, 80 miles away. A few little echoes would appear on the screen to begin with. And then slowly it would get a bigger and bigger mass, and all these echoes are kind of trembling. So you would pass a plot to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, and there was old Stuffy Dowding sitting up in his balcony watching it all happen.
Man hat dann schon ein Unterlegenheitsgefühl. Und plötzlich kamen die Engländer von ganz in bester Position auf uns zugeflogen und haben uns angegriffen.
the Air Ministry were determined not to give away the fact that we had effective radar or something in our night fighter that allowed us to close in on other aircraft at night. The Air Ministry were pressed by newspapers as to why I had had success at night. The Air Ministry decided quite deliberately that they would say that I had exceptional night vision, and they told the Commander-in-Chief in Fighter Command that he was to make sure that I realized that's what they were saying. I was then given the name by the papers as Cat's Eyes Cunningham.
But the Germans were not so easily fooled.
Da wurde uns erstmal bewusst, dass da irgendeine Einrichtung sein muss, die also diese Führungsmöglichkeit ergibt. Und das hat man damals ja noch nicht so gewusst, dieses Radar.
The Germans quickly identified the large aerials along the coastline as Dowding's secret weapon, and soon found a way to penetrate our defences and attack them.
There was only one drawback to CH radar. It could not look low enough.
Jerry used to come in, probably 2 or 3 planes at a time, under the radar, and they used to, what we say, shoot us up. You'd suddenly hear the machine guns going, you think, oh my goodness, there's an enemy overhead. So everything would go chaotic because the guns would open up and the noise was horrific.
The Germans were gaining the upper hand. Dowding desperately needed another fighting advantage. The workhorse of Fighter Command was the Hurricane, which, although effective, had its limitations.
We couldn't chase anything with the Hurricane. All the German aircraft were much faster than we were.
There really was a war on, and our backs were to the wall, and by God, we needed aircraft.
But Dowding was already one step ahead. He was instrumental in the increased production of a new and iconic aircraft, the Spitfire.
One day there was a totally different noise in the sky, and I went out, and there, high up in the blue, were 2 beautiful monoplanes, wheeling and diving and circling around. It's the most wonderful noise you can imagine. It's sort of rich and powerful and reassuring.
The Spitfire was a real match for the Messerschmitt 109s. It gave the pilots of Fighter Command a much-needed advantage.
The Spitfire excelled under extreme conditions. It responded, whatever the conditions of flight, whatever the conditions of load, whatever the speed or angle, it would give you fair warning that it was being abused. And you could do things with a Spitfire that certainly I've never been able to do with any other aircraft.
One day, the Spitfire landed on the airfield and taxied over to our hangar, and we were told it was ours. And we sat in this thing, and we walked around it, we stroked it. I fell a bit in love with this airplane. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The next day, 15 more turned up, and we were a fuzz from them. The only way I describe flying a Spitfire is you don't fly a Spitfire, you just strap it on and fly.
Although the Spitfire was faster and more maneuverable, it didn't supersede the Hurricane. In fact, the 2 planes complemented each other.
There's a split section between those that favour the Hurricane more than the Spitfire. But the fact of the matter is, the Battle of Britain could have been won by the Spitfire. But had we not had the Spitfire, The Hurricane could not have won it on its own.
But even with these two awesome fighting machines, Fighter Command was suffering the loss of 5 pilots per day. A fact that would play heavily on Dowding's mind. For many, fighting for the first time was an awakening. This was reality. Kill or be killed. It was a rite of passage for many who were still teenagers as they made their transition from boy to man. Throughout his time as Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, Hugh Dowding was concerned for the welfare of his pilots. As the defence of Britain began to get underway during July 1940, and because of the deaths of many of his pilots, his concern deepened.
It's very revealing that he referred to the pilots, who after all were, fairly tough in their own way, and he referred to them as his chicks.
And the safety of his chicks was always at the top of Dowding's mind.
One day at our airfield, a group of men arrived with bulletproof windscreens. Now, prior to that, all we had in front of us was basically perspex.
I said that I wanted bulletproof glass for the windscreens. I remember the gust of laughter sweeping round the table. I said, if Chicago gangsters can have bulletproof windows to their cars, why can't my pilots have bulletproof windscreens? I have no idea how many lives were saved by this.
We'd got a 2-inch thick bulletproof windscreen, which we knew Dowding had had to fight the Air Ministry for. So that's how we were aware of his presence, and we knew that behind the lines he was fighting for us.
Up until 1936, flying was for the affluent. Pilots, private or military, came from the wealthy families. Dowding realized that with the rise of the Nazi Party and war looming, there would be a shortage of trained pilots. Due to the massive modernization process, lads of 18 and above from different backgrounds and all walks of life suddenly had a chance to become a fighter pilot.
The idea of all being public school boys and wearing red jackets and this, that and the other, not quite true.
The government introduced a thing called the Volunteer Reserve, and I thought, this is my only chance ever to do something. So I leapt at it and volunteered for it.
The great majority were VRs, some regulars, a lot of VRs who came from all backgrounds and all walks of life, just happened to be at the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the wrong time, whichever way you want to look at it.
But for many of these young pilots, their entire training was done on slow vintage biplanes where the instructor sat in the back. With the outbreak of war, they were suddenly presented with single-seater warbirds.
In May 1940, I'd never been in the cockpit of either Spitfire or a Hurricane, and those of us who'd never flown low-wing monoplanes before had to be introduced to Spitfires, and we just had to learn.
After I'd been with the squadron about 2 days, the flight commander said, well, we better get you flying. He gave me a copy of the pilot's notes and said, go and sit quietly somewhere and read them up. And after I went back, having read them, he said, right, now you better sit in the cockpit for half an hour and find out where everything is, and which I did.
There was a book published of where all the tits and knobs were, and you just sat in the cockpit and familiarised yourself with where everything was. And when you thought you knew all about it, you went to the flight commander and said, please will you test me? And they would ask a lot of questions and said, right, off you go.
And the only advice I give you is don't put the stick forward when you take off, otherwise you'll push the propeller into the ground. Anyway, I took off safely, thank heavens, and flew around for about 45 minutes, and fortunately I managed to do a good landing, and I taxied in, and when I got out of the cockpit and walked to the flight office, for the first time in my life I felt about 6 feet tall, I think.
A chap with lots of gold braid on his cap came down and told us we had 4 to 5 weeks to learn how to fly these things and to put ourselves in the position when we could take on the might of the German Air Force.
But the might of the German Air Force took a heavy toll on our young pilots. Many didn't survive their first flight into battle.
The reason that the new boys, or the chaps who bought it, was if they were lucky they had done a few hours on a Hurricane, but not really enough to put it on like a coat, if you like, and wear it like a suit and know exactly what it could do. So it was just lack of experience.
The first 7 days we were decimated. I think we lost 9 pilots in 7 days, and 2 or 3 shot down, but got away with it.
The first 3, 4, 5 flights are always the most dangerous. You cannot train people to meet real live bullets. You cannot train them to operate at the speed that you need to.
Dowding introduced a system that would counter the lack of experience in his new trainees. He would send his battle-hardened pilots to squadrons away from the fighting, where they could pass on their hard-earned knowledge of combat to newly qualified flyers. Another advantage of this was to give his experienced pilots a well-earned rest from the relentless Nazi offensive.
My overriding memory of the Battle of Britain is tiredness, incredible tiredness, because we were on readiness from half an hour before dawn in the morning until half an hour after dusk at night.
And we slept in our clothes down at dispersal. When we were Boscombe down, we actually slept underneath the wings of our aeroplanes.
It was more stressful waiting. Most people seem to appear to try and relax and sleep, but you were very much on edge.
In dispersal arc, we had a bunch of camp beds which you threw ourselves on and went to sleep as soon as you landed. In fact, at that stage in my life, I went to sleep. Whenever you stopped doing anything, I went to sleep. Standing, sitting, or wherever it was.
Okay, chaps, rumble.
But despite the discomfort, Fighter Command's 3,000 men and women faithfully followed Dowding's lead.
We can never ensure home defense by the operation of Fighter Command. It can never take the initiative. That depends on the enemy. Will he send over single machines, or very small formations, or will he depend on monstrous hammer blows every 24 hours by every available machine? We must be prepared for all possibilities. We must be prepared for anything.
But Dowding wasn't prepared for the conspiracy from within his own ranks.
A message, sir.
The Luftwaffe was just one of his enemies. Many more roamed the corridors of the Royal Air Force itself. By September 1940, over 200 fighter pilots had been killed in action. The deaths of so many young men, Dowding's chicks, weighed heavily on his mind.
He lost his first wife not so long after they'd been married. And I'm sure that, like so many people, he was anxious to find whether there was, in fact, a life after death.
His interest in spiritualism following the death of his wife grew to become a large part of his life. In fact, in later years, Dowding felt he could see and talk to his fighter pilots, his chicks, who had been killed.
He used to go into his lounge, apparently, and see pilots there and talk to them, because he felt very guilty.
I have made some new friends whom I have never seen on Earth, and yet who rank between the dearest and most intimate of my acquaintances.
One would have thought it was way beyond him, but of course he was a much deeper person than people might have thought.
It was strange at first, but I have now got quite accustomed to carrying long and intimate conversations with invisible and inaudible presences.
One thing that impressed me was the humility of the man, the gentleness of him. Any man that would normally occupy such an elevated position in any of our armed services would have been, well, upright and either exercising authority, but not Lord Dowding.
I don't mind if half of you think that I ought to have my head examined. I don't mind particularly what people think of me personally.
In the case of young pilots who were inexperienced, 19, 20, 21 years old, were thrust into battle, and in some cases on their first flight, they were literally plunged into the next world. Some of these young men do not know where they are. They do not realize that they're dead.
These poor lads whose physical lives are suddenly blotted out in the heat of action. They feel exactly as they did a moment before. They have apparently the same bodies and the same clothing. They can generally still see and hear people in the flesh, though they cannot make themselves seen and heard.
I was billeted out with the family, and one day they invited me to sit in at a seance by one of the villagers who was a medium, and she said, I have somebody with me today who wants to show himself to you. And she changed into the physical appearance of my old buddy who had been shot down in 1941. I wasn't expecting anything, and this was so powerful that I found it almost unbelievable.
I am happy when I am allowed to take part in rescue work, awakening the lads who have made the ultimate sacrifice for us.
Dowding's belief in spiritualism would provide the ammunition used by those who plotted against him during the closing stages of the Battle of Britain. A staunch believer of Dowding and his policies was Air Vice Marshal Keith Park. He was the controller of Number 11 Group, guarding London and the home counties. 11 Group was the front line of the battle and took most of the glory for the defence of England.
Park was a New Zealander, and he had the sort of informality that New Zealanders and people from the Antipodean countries have. He flew the aeroplanes that we flew. He flew Hurricanes, and he used to plant those Hurricanes outside dispersal, even join the battle.
He used to fly around and visit us all and listen to what we said, because I loosed off at him one day, because I was very angry. And I told him what I thought about the organisation, and it was changed 3 days later.
Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory was the controller of Number 12 Group, based in the Midlands. His task was to support Park's group in the defence of the southeast.
Lee Mallory was a staff officer, pure and simple, and I am not saying this unkindly, but he was a brain picker. He had people around him to advise him, and very often he took the wrong advice.
Lee Mallory was a very ambitious man. He was good. He was a good chap. He thought the sun shone out of my backside, but he he had this idea that he could gain fame and fortune with the big wing.
During the Battle of Britain, Mallory began to promote the big wing idea. This was to gather together up to 5 squadrons, around 50 aircraft, in mid-air and attack the incoming German raid en masse. Mallory put this idea to Park and the pilots of his 11 Group.
We said no, and which both Air Vice Marshal Park and Dowding agreed with.
Park could see that the big wing contained 2 different types of aircraft, Hurricanes and Spitfires. The Spitfire was faster than the Hurricane, and it would have to wait.
When you get the big wing, okay, it can make a big impact, but it takes time. And the one thing that wasn't available during the battle was time. I'd say it would have been a total failure.
What a waste of time. Forming up, and all at that time the bombers are coming in and are probably on the way out.
Dowding and Park refused to adopt Mallory's big wing philosophy, but Mallory disobeyed orders and used it anyway. As a consequence, he was often late in coming to the assistance of Park's 11 group.
I think it was self-glory he was after Keith Park's job.
Mallory took his big wing philosophy to friends at the Air Ministry, friends who were prepared to undermine Dowding.
There was a group of people that wanted Dowding removed. He was the loner, and he'd naturally, fighting for the pilots, he'd be battling with the Air Ministry all the time. But then, in September, we started the problems of what was called the big wing philosophy, which Lee Mallory brought into being, and Sholto Douglas, who was at the Air Ministry, gave him the fullest support.
Douglas was everything that Dowding was not, amusing and entertaining. He got on well with others and enjoyed partying. He knew how to get the best from people at social functions, which stood him in good stead. Together, Douglas and Lee Mallory conspired to remove Dowding and Park from their offices and change their plan for defense.
The whole thing was set up to humiliate Dowding, to try to prove that his handling of the battle had been wrong, and that Lee Mallory and the bigwigs was the way in which the battle should have been fought.
Even Dowding's belief in spiritualism was used against him.
The people who'd attacked him in the Royal Air Force used this as a denigration of his character, his personality, even suggesting that perhaps his brain was getting a little bit muddled.
Unfortunately, at the height of the Battle of Britain, this campaign against Dowding reached the highest authority.
Behind Dowding's back, they were building up a case against him until there was a meeting in October when the whole thing was dealt with, and as a result of that, Dowding was just removed from office.
Churchill told me that I was to be replaced as Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command.
Message, sir.
He told me of his surprise that this recommendation should have been made in the moment of victory, but did not indicate any personal opposition. It seemed natural enough. The Air Council had been anxious to be rid of me since before the start of the war, and this seemed to be an appropriate moment.
Dowding was not alone. Keith Park was forced out as well.
Having won the battle, they were removed out of the way with no credit at all.
Two very worthwhile chaps, and between them they saved the country.
Sholto Douglas took over Dowding's role as Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command and immediately gave Trafford Lee Mallory the control of No. 11 Group. Mallory and Douglas set about changing the plans for defense with their big wing philosophy, a theory that many pilots felt was completely unsuitable for defense. Fortunately for Britain, this change happened just as Germany abandoned its plans for invasion.
Had we followed the policies they would have liked to have promoted, we would have lost the Battle of Britain. And if we'd lost the Battle of Britain, we would have lost the war.
By the end of November, Churchill realized that he could safely tell the nation that the invasion for 1940 had certainly been thwarted and that the Germans had been beaten back.
Churchill said that he wanted me to go to the United States. I said that I did not wish to accept such an appointment. Churchill replied, "I have the right to demand that you should accept." So I went.
Churchill declared that on Christmas Day, 1940, that every church bell in the country will be rung to celebrate the fact that we had beaten back the German attempts to invade us. Dowding was not even in the country when the church bells to celebrate the victory were rung.
He eventually retired to a quiet life in the country without receiving official recognition. But many who served under him knew where the credit lay.
I think the politicians didn't give Dowding the honours he deserved.
He was an intensely sincere man, intensely patriotic, and he loved us, the chaps who did his fighting for him, as though we were children. He is a grand man in many respects.
Fighter Command was a remarkably good organisation. The Commander-in-Chief, Stuffy Dowding, was a brilliant operator, and he had conceived the whole layout, the whole setup, and he ran it perfectly.
I don't think that the people who really won the Battle of Britain have ever been given the proper credit, and that a lot of fictitious lines used in bathtubs did. It's as simple as that.
Dowding's foresight, pre-planning and organisation saved Britain from invasion. Although he never received significant recognition during his lifetime, in 1988 a statue to his memory was finally placed outside St Clement's Danes, the Royal Air Force Church in London, as one of the saviours of Britain.